Good morning, it's 9:32. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Ukraine's president has told the European Union it acted too late to stop the Russian invasion by failing to impose sanctions and failing to block the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline earlier. Volodymyr Zelensky said he was grateful to the EU for the steps they've taken, but urged the Union not to be late in accepting Ukraine's membership. Meanwhile, Ukraine's new agriculture minister says global food prices will continue to rise if the situation in the country following Russia's invasion doesn't change. He said Ukraine's grain stocks for export amount to $7.5 billion. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss says the Taliban's decision to shut school doors to girls in Afghanistan is unjustifiable. The foreign ministers of the US, Canada, France, Italy, Norway, and the High Representative of the European Union have also condemned the decision. In the UK, the government's announcing a tenfold increase in public electric car charging points. The Department for Transport's investing £500 million. It's looking to boost the UK's 30,000 charge points to 300,000 by 2030. A loophole allowing drivers to avoid punishment for using their mobile phone for taking photos or playing games is now closed. The new rule bans virtually all hand use of mobiles on Britain's roads, with anyone caught facing a potential fine of up to £1,000 as well as 6 points on their licence. And COVID restrictions in Wales are set to be relaxed further from Monday. The legal requirement to wear face coverings in shops and on public transport will end, as well as the need to self-isolate. Masks will still be required in health and care settings, and businesses must continue to carry out COVID-19 risk assessments. TV online and DAB Plus Radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Tom Harwood.
Good morning, it's 9:34 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, Wednesday's statement from Chancellor Rishi Sunak is still being pored over by the press. Despite a well-articulated litany of tax cuts and support, the reaction to the spring statement has not been as rosy as perhaps the Treasury would have liked to see. Of course, many of the positive changes made are now seen to be wiped out by the highest inflation we have experienced in 30 years. Well, joining me now to dissect this is Greg Smith, the Conservative MP for Buckingham and chair of the Free Market Forum group of MPs. Welcome to the programme. First of all, the way that this statement has landed, the expectation that more than 1 million people may fall into absolute poverty despite the measures in the statement, has it gone far enough?
Well, I think the statement was fundamentally a very good one. That was a step back in the right direction of a smaller state, one that taxes people less, because we know when that you keep more money in people's back pockets, when you enable businesses to keep more of their profits, the economy grows. People have more discretionary spend. Businesses spend more on investment, new machinery, taking on more floor space, employing more people, and the economy grows. And so I think the Chancellor has taken some good steps to move away from the higher taxing, bigger state we've seen, particularly through the emergency measures of the coronavirus crisis, and back to a path of lower taxes and higher growth. Was it enough? Well, time we'll see. I have a lot of sympathy for the Chancellor in terms of the level of debt that he has incurred on behalf of the nation to pay for furlough and the business grants and everything that kept people afloat through the pandemic, which was the right thing to do. And he is being very hawkish on the deficit. But I'm of the view that we can possibly push this further. We can deliver bigger tax cuts to get people having more money in their back pocket, more discretionary spend, counter-inflationary measures, and businesses growing.
It's interesting looking at the language around the tax cuts that the Chancellor was using, because he used very particular words. He said these were the largest tax cuts to personal taxes in the last 25 years. Now, that's of course because taxes on businesses are rising, taxes elsewhere are rising. The overall tax burden is going from 33% of GDP in 2020 to 36.3% of GDP in a few years' time. That's the highest tax burden since the time of Clement Attlee. Is this focus on personal taxes ignoring, at the expense of potentially the businesses that actually grow the economy, is that a bit of smoke and mirrors?
I don't think it's smoke and mirrors. I think you're right to say that the focus of this spring statement was very much on personal taxation, and we've got to get personal taxes down. If you don't get personal taxes down, then people don't spend and they don't buy the things that businesses manufacture or services that they provide, and nobody wins. So yes, this spring statement was very much about personal taxation. The budget last year did have many more measures in it around business taxes. The super deduction in particular, I know, has gone down very well in my constituency. I've spoken to lots of businesses in our enterprise zones and further afield who have invested. They have bought more machinery. They have taken on more floor space and employed more people because of the super deduction. But that is, of course, time limited. And what I would love to see the Chancellor do, either later this year or in the main budget when we get it in the autumn, is make things like the super deduction permanent. Cut business taxes. If you're throttling business with taxation, then the economy is not going to grow, and the revenue will actually see a decrease in funds coming in to pay for the things that people in this country rightly want to see well funded, the NHS and schools and policing.
It was interesting listening to the Chancellor, because it did sound like he got this. It did sound like he was saying that we need to raise the growth rate in this country, because, of course, whilst it was impressive last year, the fastest in the G7, it is getting pretty anemic in the years to come in all the projections. So beyond the super deduction, potentially some sort of permanence around that, fostering a better environment for investment, what other issues would you like to see addressed to raise that growth rate in the UK?
Well, I think we've got some very urgent things that we've got to address. The 5p cut in fuel duty, for example, it was great news for a lot of businesses, as well as all of us filling up our petrol and diesel cars. But I think we do need to look at the overall impact of the cost of fuel on the business sector, particularly the road haulage sector, particularly bus companies, coach companies, transport companies that obviously have to fill up with petrol or diesel. That is going to be a counter-inflationary measure if we can drive that down even further. The Road Haulage Association, for example, asked for a 15p cut in fuel duty for essential users. So much of inflation is driven by the cost of transporting goods, food, equipment, products that people want to buy around the country. And so the fuel duty cut will help. Can we go further to really ensure that we're taking those counter-inflationary measures and not hampering business with disproportionately high transportation costs? I think we do need to look going forward at corporation tax. Obviously, the Chancellor did put that up in recent times. My view is that the lower you get corporation tax, the more chance you've got of businesses growing, and even more importantly, people choosing to invest in the United Kingdom, to expand their businesses into the UK and set up new businesses in
Certainly.
the UK. That is something that we fundamentally need to happen, and corporation tax is a key driver on that.
Well, there'll be a lot for the Chancellor to discuss in his autumn budget. It seems like he's getting more and more fiscal events and statements as the time goes on. But for now, Greg Smith, Conservative MP for Buckingham, thank you for joining us on the briefing this morning.
Thank you.
Turning now to international affairs, day 30 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and NATO, G7 and EU leaders have held an emergency meeting in Brussels to reinforce their support for Ukraine and discuss further measures against Moscow. US President Joe Biden warned Russia to expect a response in kind if chemical weapons are used, stating that NATO has never been more united. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has reiterated Britain's backing for Ukraine, saying the government plans to send 6,000 more missiles to the country to support its defensive efforts. But what does this all mean? What has been agreed and what will happen now? Joining me is Andrew Lillico, Executive Director and Principal of Europe Economics. Welcome to the programme, Andrew. It's interesting, all of these big summits, all of these events. I'm always curious as to how much is actually agreed at the summit and how much of it is just rubber stamping what's gone beforehand. Do you think there has been a significant move forward thanks to yesterday's meetings?
I think a lot of the value of summits and these set-piece events is that they create a focal point, which means that there's a deadline by which the various bureaucrats have to prepare things and agree things. So whilst it's easy to say, well, is it really very likely that that much in the way of decisions was made by the leaders at the summit themselves? I think that's a little bit unfair in that it's important to create that focal point. Otherwise, nothing ever gets done.
What the West was sort of thinking about in terms of how well Russia was doing. I've been reading recently the number of think pieces and pieces of analysis that were saying that Russia would take Kyiv in hours as soon as they invaded Ukraine. That seems to now have turned a corner. Last night, the Prime Minister told another television channel that he thinks that Ukraine could actually win this war. Is that likely?
Well, it's obviously very difficult for us sitting here, in the UK a long way away, and the people in the battlefield, the information about these things is relatively sparse. But it does seem to me that from a political perspective, we've reached the point at which the possibility of Ukraine actually winning outright now has to come onto the table. For a long time, that seemed truly fanciful. And now it's the kind of thing which politics has to engage with. I feel a little bit like there was some overcompensation from the very rapid collapse of the Afghan forces. And so the Western intelligence agencies had suggested that the Afghan forces might hold on for quite a long time. And actually, they collapsed almost immediately. And I think perhaps there was a little bit of overcompensation of saying, well, we better assume that they collapse almost immediately here in the Ukraine, so I think that was something of that. There's also undoubtedly the fact that the Western forces had trained the Ukrainians for an insurgency. So the assumption was the Russians would win eventually, but then maybe the Ukrainians would bleed them out over time. I've seen some analyses suggesting that they were trained to try to kill 8 Russians a day. If they could kill 8 or more Russians a day, then eventually that would make it intolerable for the Russians to stay. But they're killing more like 400 Russians a day at the moment. So the success of the Ukrainians has been absolutely spectacular. And of course, they've had a long time to prepare for this. They've known the Russians were coming since 2014. And Ukraine's a large place. It's not like some of the other places that the Russians pushed over, like Georgia, which were much smaller. So there's a lot of the Ukrainians, about a third of the population of Russia. A lot of them had quite strong military training. So perhaps it shouldn't be as much of a surprise to people as it was. Also, probably the Russian military, which had quite a bad reputation back into the 80s and 90s, maybe people overreacted to the way it did quite well in Syria. And they've kind of thought, the Russians have become much more powerful again, whereas actually it seems that some of that was exaggerated. The Russians seem to have failed to have gained most of their strategic objectives at this point. Perhaps if they can finally finish off Mariupol, they'll establish that land corridor between the Crimea back into Russia, and they might think of that as a worthwhile objective. Up around Kiev, they seem to be having some bad problems. There's some Ukrainian counterattacks, capturing some Russian forces in a pocket, and so on. But perhaps the bigger story is that because things have stabilized for quite a long time, you then get into a situation of attrition. And in a battle of attrition, it seems, at least from the data that we have, that the Russians are likely to lose because they just won't be able to sustain their fighting intensity for long enough. And although it could be that the Ukrainians would run out of Western weapons. And so things like the Boris Johnson's announcement of the extra 6,000 and the package of additional weapons that the Americans have agreed to supply are quite important for sustaining the Ukrainian fight for a while. Also, and if they can do that, then the Russians are likely only to be able to, it seems like their actual ability to sustain fighting intensity is already fallen away, according to some of the analyses, and they may start to collapse altogether within about a month. One thing about
Remarkable.
that
No
is
one would
that-
have expected this. No one would have expected this that long ago. I suppose we don't have that long to wait to see what happens. I guess the worry is as well that the Russians' tactics will become more extreme the longer this drags on. I suppose there's more to wait for. But for now, Andrew Lillico, thank you for joining us this morning on The Briefing to discuss that. And now for something completely different. I've been struck in recent weeks by the remarkable difference between how the world sees Britain and how we, or perhaps I should say our media, see ourselves. Perhaps blinkered by Brexit, too many in this country look out for only the worst in us, misinterpreting and distorting the truth of the good that we do, fixed with a bad news filter that does not beset the rest of the world. In recent days, polling has shown that Ukrainians themselves view the UK more favourably than any other country, asked by US pollsters Signal. Within Ukraine, Boris Johnson has a net approval rating of plus 50, ahead of any other leader other than Ukraine's own President Zelensky. Double that of Biden or German Chancellor Scholz. Meanwhile, Russia is spitting with fury at the UK for being what it sees as, quote, the most anti-Russian, for which we should read anti-Putin, government in the world. And it's easy to see why. Despite a self-flagellatory media too often intent on painting the UK as if it is hated, weak or slow, the reality is quite different. The UK was the first in the world to close off its airspace to Russian planes. Aeroflot was banned from flying into the UK on Thursday, the 24th of February. The EU followed suit on the Sunday. The UK was the first to go furthest on financial sanctions, arguably those that bite the Kremlin the hardest. Prioritising the banking system has been the biggest impactful event, although admittedly it's not as PR-friendly as seizing an empty yacht. But more importantly than optics, the UK is pushing for fuller action on the SWIFT banking system, something that some European leaders are sadly resisting. And when it comes to military action, UK troops have been training the Ukrainian military for years. Last year, the UK supplied 2 minesweepers and jointly built 8 ships for Ukraine's Black Sea Fleet. And of course, the UK was sending those crucial anti-tank missiles to Ukraine all the way back in January, when most of the media hadn't twigged what was going on in Eastern Europe. Germany, on the other hand, sent just 5,000 helmets to Ukraine at the start of February. The German government refused to provide weapons in the face of possible Russian invasion. The helmet move was slammed by the mayor of Kiev at the time as an absolute joke. Indeed, it's remarkable how in Zelensky's address to the German Bundestag recently, he criticised the country over its prioritising of the economy over opposition to Russia preparing for a great war. On sanctions, Zelensky told the Bundestag, quote, "We saw delays. We felt resistance. We understood that you wanted to continue the economy. Economy, economy." Now, can you imagine if he'd said anything like that to our parliament here in the United Kingdom? No, instead he praised the British people, evoked Churchill and Shakespeare. He showed an appreciation for the United Kingdom that is shared by Ukrainians and people across the world. Sadly, it's not shared by far too much of our political class and our media. Take yesterday's NATO summit. Boris was greeting and meeting foreign heads of states, shaking their hand, making conversation. How did Twitter, some politicians and some unscrupulous journalists present it? By snipping up 10 seconds of footage to pretend that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom was isolated. They genuinely claimed he was, quote, snubbed, despite video and pictorial evidence to the contrary. Now, the UK is one of the most important countries in the world, and that status was reflected yesterday. And let us not forget that at the start of February, before the invasion, there was one flag in particular at the front and centre of the Ukrainian Parliament's show of thanks for international support. It was the British flag. It was our flag. And yet we shrink from the idea that our country might be doing some good in the world, that we might be leading in the way of opposition to Putin's war of aggression. How sad. And moving on to something really quite left field. We've reported on this programme before about the drug death epidemic in Scotland, a crisis that has more than doubled in the last decade in a seemingly unstoppable spiral. Well, one country that used to hold the title of a drug death capital of Europe was Portugal. and it has since massively reduced the harm associated with drug taking. How? It took the radical step of decriminalising drug consumption to treat it as a health issue rather than a criminal one. Well, online media company Joe.co.uk sent their head of news, Ollie Dugmore, to find out how it works. Let's take a short look at a clip.
So I headed to Lisbon to see, firsthand, the health-based approach that might have saved Martha's life. And it wasn't long before I encountered its consequences.
The big packet is good price. This is rocket is the best. Test, no problem. Test here. Problem for me, I have too much.
It's definitely something, because my lips are tingling. As I put in my PIN, I wondered whether decriminalisation made anyone safer, or just made it easier to get high.
I think that might be the first time that British television has shown a drug deal at this time in the morning. But I'm delighted to say that Ollie Dugmore from Joe.co.uk is here in the studio with me, because this is an important subject, isn't it? This is a serious subject, and it's about reducing harm for people. Can you tell us why you went to Portugal?
Sure. Portugal used to have a very serious drug problem. At one time, about 1 in 10 people in Portugal were heroin users. The UK is in a similar situation now, obviously not with 10% of the population taking heroin, but particularly in Scotland, England and Wales as well, record levels of drug deaths. And I think either you say, OK, well, we're just happy with more than 5,000 people dying every year as a result of drug use, or you say we're a compassionate, caring society that thinks these people's lives are valuable and we should do something about it.
What you did in Portugal was illegal, and yet you weren't arrested. You actually met with a policeman. What was that all about?
Yeah, sure. So if you have what's judged to be a personal use quantity of a drug, so in that case, cocaine, if you have 1.5 grams of that on your person, that's viewed basically as an administrative offence. It's as severe as getting a parking ticket. So if the police catch you with that amount of cocaine on you, they refer you to a dissuasion commission, which is essentially a doctor, a lawyer, and a sociologist. And if they judge that you don't have a drug problem, you're essentially, you were out on the town, you're having a good time, whatever, they then say, OK, off you go, take care. And if they judge that you are a problem drug user, they then refer you on to rehabilitation or different aspects of care.
But this isn't to glamorise it in any way. This is to say that this is a bad thing, just as getting a parking ticket is a bad thing. But potentially there are benefits to this approach, this more humane approach. You can understand why many people watching would think, hang on, that sounds incredibly counterintuitive. If you lessen punishment, surely that would increase use.
Yeah, and I would forgive people for thinking that, but Portugal is a very clear example that it's not the case. Drug deaths have decreased massively. They used to be the drug death capital of Europe. They're not anymore. Scotland is. Drug use decreases their HIV rate. They had a spiralling HIV crisis as a result of intravenous drug use. Again, that's decreasing. Guess where the UK's biggest outbreak of HIV in 30 years is? It's in Glasgow among the drug-injecting population. Yes, it's not necessarily something that should be glamorised, but either you say there's 5,000 people who are dying every year that we need to take care of and do something about, or you don't, and you continue pursuing the UK's 50-year policy of prohibition.
Just finally in this conversation, do you sense that there's any sort of political movement on this issue, or is this something that politicians just don't want to talk about?
I think there's no political movement on it whatsoever. I think it's a minefield for a politician to deal with. Portugal's case was interesting and unique because the problem was so widespread, it created a massive political consensus to do something about it. Take it out of a criminal issue and turn it into a healthcare one. The UK is sadly not in that position.
Well, Ollie Dugmore, thank you very much for coming in to talk about that fascinating issue and that way that potentially lives could be saved. Well, that's it for the programme today. We've run out of time. Coming up next, of course, it's To The Point with Patrick and Anaya. But first, here's the weather.
Good morning. Alex Deacon here with your latest weather update from the Met Office. A crackerjack of a Friday, if you like. Spring sunshine. Yes, it's a bit misty and murky in places, and it's a bit chilly out there this morning, but plenty more sunshine to come today and into the weekend because of this. A chunky area of high pressure that's been steadily building through the week and is going to last into the weekend. As I said, it's a bit chilly out there first thing, and there is some mist and fog. Parts of Northern Ireland may take a couple more hours before that clears away. There's a thicker cloud across Shetland as well. We'll see some rain on and off here that may just drift towards Orkney later. This afternoon, the small chance of 1 or 2 isolated showers over northern England, Northern Ireland, perhaps across the mountains of Wales. But for the vast majority, it is simply a sunny and pretty warm day. Temperatures well above the average for the time of year. 15, 16, 18, 19, perhaps across the south. It is a cooler day across East Anglia and the Kent coast, with the breeze picking up a little bit here. That breeze strengthening further along the south coast overnight. We'll keep some patchy rain over the Northern Isles overnight, but otherwise it's dry and clear. It will turn pretty cold pretty quickly if you're heading out this evening. Bear that in mind. By dawn, temperatures down, even in urban areas, pretty close to freezing, and certainly in the countryside, a touch of frost to start the weekend. Could be a bit of mist and fog around here and there as well on Saturday morning, and some coast may be a little misty at times this weekend, but generally it is a sunny Saturday. Still some thicker cloud close to Shetland, a little bit of drizzle here and there, a bit of a breeze along the south coast, but not as windy as last weekend. And the sun is getting stronger and stronger now, so lifting those temperatures again by the afternoon widely into the mid to high teens. Some coast will be a little bit cooler. And again, if you're heading out on Saturday night, temperatures will drop sharply. Another chilly start on Sunday, but another fine, bright day, dry with plenty of sunny spells and quite warm once more by Sunday afternoon. Goodbye.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content